The leather-bound ledger burned in my hands. Eleanor's decade plan, page by page detailing how to ruin me. My mother-in-law's bribes, my career sabotage, all right here. Mark's footsteps echoed down the hall. I shoved the book behind a stack of files. The security consultant lunged, his grip crushing my wrist. I swung the crystal vase. Glass shattered. Blood splattered the wall. Now I'm running. The ledger clutched to my chest, and the truth is worse than I imagined. The miscarriage wasn't an accident. She did this. The car engine roars, but the words won't stop screaming in my head. She poisoned me. Dust motes danced in the shafts of afternoon light, piercing Eleanor's private sanctuary. Sarah's fingertips grazed the mahogany desk, tracing a path through the scent of beeswax and stale Virginia Slims. Her thumb caught on the edge of a false drawer bottom. It gave way with a dry click, revealing a leather-bound ledger nestled in the velvet lining. The pages groaned as she pried them open. Inside, Eleanor's elegant cursive marched across the cream paper like rows of infantry. Sarah's pulse thrummed against her collarbone. Under the heading Project Miller, dates stretched across a decade. March 2014. A red line struck through Sarah's name for the junior partnership. Beside it, Eleanor's script noted, "Contacted the board regarding the unstable apartment fire." Seeds planted. The air in the office grew heavy, tasting of copper. Sarah flipped further, her knuckles whitening against the binding. June 2018. The promotion to creative director. Quietly informed the donor committee of Sarah's fictitious struggle with sobriety. Recommendation retracted. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the solar plexus. This wasn't just a diary. It was a map of a minefield Eleanor had laid beneath Sarah's feet for 10 years. Every unlucky break, every misunderstanding with a boss, every glass of wine Eleanor had sympathetically poured while Sarah cried about another career setback, it was all here. Eleanor hadn't been her mentor. She had been her architect of ruin. The rhythmic scritch-scritch of Sarah's thumb against the sea glass in her pocket accelerated, the jagged edge of the glass biting into her skin. She needed to move. The ledger was heavy, its weight a physical manifestation of a decade's worth of lies. She tucked it under her arm, the leather cold against her ribs. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that precedes a predator's strike. Downstairs, the grandfather clock chimed the hour. A deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the floorboards and into Sarah's heels. She had to get out. She had to take this evidence to someone who could help her tear Eleanor's world apart. Sarah moved toward the door, her breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches. She reached for the brass handle, but the sound of footsteps on the stairs froze her. They were rhythmic, deliberate. Click, click, click. Eleanor's heels on the hardwood. Sarah scrambled, her eyes darting around the room. There was no time to run. She shoved the ledger behind a stack of heavy architectural files on the corner of the desk, praying the dark binding would blend into the shadows of the mahogany. The door swung open. Mark stood there, his golden boy features softened by a confused smile. He adjusted his Rolex, the metal links clicking. "Sarah, what are you doing in here? Mom's looking for you. We're supposed to head to the club for brunch, right?" Sarah forced her hands to her sides, hiding the tremor in her fingers. I thought I left my phone in here. I was just checking the desk." Mark stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the space. He mirrored her posture, leaning slightly to the left just as she was doing. It was a habit that used to feel like intimacy, but now felt like a mockery. "You look pale, babe. Are you sure you're okay? You've been acting a little off lately, you know?" "I'm fine, Mark. Just a headache." She moved past him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She left the ledger behind, the secret heat of it seemingly radiating from behind the files. She had to come back for it. She couldn't leave her life's destruction sitting in Eleanor's office. As she descended the grand staircase, the smell of expensive lilies choked the air. Eleanor was waiting at the bottom, her silver hair pulled into a chignon so tight it looked like it was pulling the skin from her forehead. She held her silver pillbox, clicking the latch. Click, clack, click, clack, 4 times. "There you are, Sarah," Eleanor said, her voice a melodic silk noose. "We were beginning to think you'd vanished into the woodwork. You look quite peaked. Perhaps the Hamptons air is too thin for you today?" Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't. She just felt the sea glass in her pocket, its sharpness the only thing keeping her grounded as she followed them out to the car, her mind already plotting the return trip to that office. The brunch was a blur of white linen and clinking silverware. Sarah sat like a statue, the we and darling of Eleanor's speech washing over her like a toxic tide. She waited for the moment they returned to the estate. When they finally pulled back into the driveway, Sarah claimed she needed a nap. She waited until she heard the downstairs television hum with the news before she crept back toward the study. The hallway was a narrow throat of shadows. Sarah moved with the grace of a ghost, her feet silent on the runner. She reached the study door and slipped inside. The ledger was where she'd left it. She grabbed it, the weight of it a relief, and turned to leave. A shadow blocked the light from the hallway. Thomas Wright, Eleanor's security consultant, stood there. He was a wall of a man in a suit a size too small. He didn't say a word. He just looked at the book in her hand. He stepped forward, the floorboards groaning under his weight. "Mrs. Miller wants that back," he growled. "Get out of my way," Sarah snapped, her voice trembling. He lunged. Sarah dodged, but his hand caught her shoulder, spinning her against the wall. The air left her lungs in a wheeze. He reached for the ledger, his fingers thick and calloused. Sarah felt a surge of pure, primal rage. She reached out, her hand closing around a heavy crystal vase on a side table. She swung it with everything she had. The crystal met his forearm with a sickening thud. He roared, his arm dropping, and Sarah bolted. She sprinted down the corridor, the sound of his heavy boots behind her. 12, 13, 14. He counted under his breath as he hit the stairs. Sarah didn't look back. She burst through the side door into the humid afternoon air and scrambled into her car. The engine roared to life, and she tore down the gravel driveway, the tires spitting stones. She didn't stop until she was miles away. Pulled over under the shade of a weeping willow on a back road. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely open the book. She flipped to a section marked with a blue ribbon. August 2021. Her miscarriage. The words on the page blurred. The tonic is working. Sarah complains of cramping. The doctor confirms the loss, a necessary setback to ensure she remains dependent on Mark's support. The air in the car turned freezing. The herbal tea Eleanor had brewed for her every morning during her first trimester, the one she said would strengthen the womb, had been a poison. A sob broke from Sarah's throat, a jagged, raw sound. It wasn't just her career Eleanor had stolen. It was her child. She threw the car into gear, her eyes burning with a cold, lethal clarity. She needed David. David Thompson was the only person who knew how to turn paper into a weapon. The city was a grid of heat and noise. Sarah pulled up to the curb in front of a dingy coffee shop in Queens, her eyes scanning the mirrors. Her bank cards had been declined at the gas station an hour ago. A quick call to the automated line confirmed the worst. Account frozen due to suspicious activity. Please contact your primary administrator. Eleanor had cut the oxygen. She walked into the shop, the bell above the door jangling. David was in a corner booth, surrounded by a mountain of files and the smell of stale espresso. He looked up, his ring of keys jingling as he shifted. "Sarah? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I've seen the devil, David," she whispered, sliding into the booth. She reached into her bag. "I have it. The ledger. It's all here. The bribes, the sabotage, the miscarriage." She pulled the book out and slammed it onto the table. "Look at it. Look at what she did." David reached for the book, his expression grim. "If this is what you say it is, we can go to the DA. We can end this." Sarah watched him open the cover. She waited for the shock to register on his face. She waited for the validation she had craved for a decade. David frowned. He flipped a page, then another. He looked up at her, his brow furrowed. "Sarah, what is this?" "It's the ledger," she said, her voice rising. "Read the entries for March 2014. David turned the book toward her. Sarah's heart stopped. The elegant cursive was gone. In its place were pages and pages of frantic, looping scribbles. It looked like a child had tried to mimic her own handwriting, but the words were nonsense. "The birds are watching the silver box. The glass is sharp because the sun is loud. I need to hide the keys in the water." "No," Sarah whispered, grabbing the book. She flipped through the pages. It was all like that, a rambling, psychotic diary. "This isn't it." She switched it. She must have switched it when I hid it in the office. David leaned back, his keys jangling in a mournful rhythm. "Sarah, you told me you were stressed. You told me you weren't sleeping. But this looks like a breakdown." "It's a plant, David. Look at the handwriting. It looks like mine because she's been studying me for years." "Sarah," David said softly, reaching across the table. "Maybe we should call Mark. Maybe Eleanor was right about you needing a break." Sarah recoiled as if he'd burned her. The betrayal was a physical weight. Even David, her shield, was looking at her with that same pitying condescension she'd seen in Mark's eyes. She grabbed the fake diary and backed away from the table. "I'm not crazy," she hissed, "and I'm not stopping." She bolted out of the coffee shop, the humid air hitting her like a wall. She got into her car, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had to get to her apartment. She had copies of other documents there, emails, bank statements she'd printed months ago. She pulled onto the Long Island Expressway, the traffic a sea of shimmering metal. She pressed the brake as she approached a line of cars, but the pedal went soft. It sank all the way to the floorboard. "No, no, no," she whimpered, pumping the brake. Nothing. The car gained speed on the slight incline. She yanked the emergency brake, but the handle snapped off in her hand. The world turned into a blur of screaming horns and flashing chrome. She swerved, the car clipping a concrete barrier with a bone-jarring crunch. She spun, the horizon tilting wildly, until the car finally slammed into a water-filled barrel at the exit ramp. The airbag exploded, a white wall of dust and impact. Sarah sat in the silence that followed, the smell of gunpowder and chemicals filling her lungs. Her head throbbed. She reached for her phone to call for help, but the screen was dead. She looked at the dashboard. A small red light was blinking on the security console. Her home system, linked to her car, showed a notification. Security override active. all gates unlocked, system disarmed. She wasn't just being watched, she was being erased. The safe house was a motel in New Jersey that smelled of industrial lavender and despair. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, her bruised ribs aching with every breath. A knock at the door made her jump, her hand flying to the sea glass in her pocket. "Sarah, it's Mark. Please, open up." She opened the door. Mark stood there, looking devastated. He wasn't alone. Dr. Aris, her therapist, was behind him, his hands clasped in front of him. "Go away," Sarah said, her voice a ghost of itself. "We just want to help, darling," Mark said, stepping into the room. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "Eleanor sent me these. She didn't want to, but she was worried about your safety after the accident." He handed her the folder. Inside were medical records. They were on Dr. Aris's letterhead. They detailed a history of dissociative episodes and paranoid delusions dating back 5 years. "I never said these things," Sarah whispered. Looking at Aris, the doctor stepped forward, the pop, pop, pop of his knuckles echoing in the small room. "Sarah, we discussed your tendency to project your trauma onto Eleanor. These records are just a reflection of our sessions. You've been very ill." "You're lying," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. "She's paying you. I found the wire transfer receipt." Mark sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. "Sarah, there is no receipt. You're seeing things that aren't there. You've been through so much. We just want you to get better, you know. We can go to a place where they can help you. A quiet place." "I'm not going anywhere with you," Sarah said. She backed toward the bathroom. "Get out." When they finally left, Sarah collapsed on the floor. She realized the trap was total. Her husband, her doctor, her lawyer, they were all pieces on Eleanor's board. She needed a new way in. She remembered Robert. Mark's brother, Robert, had died in a boating accident 2 years ago. But before he died, he'd pulled Sarah aside at a Christmas party. He'd been drunk, his tie crooked, the only time she'd seen it that way. "The vault," he'd whispered. "If anything happens, check the vault in the city, the one with the green light." The bank was a cathedral of marble and freezing air. Sarah stood at the counter, her fingers blue. She had Robert's spare key. She'd found it in an old coat pocket months ago. "Box 402, she told the teller. The woman led her into the bowels of the building, past the silent security guard who refused to look at her. They reached the vault. The teller turned her key, Sarah turned hers. The heavy steel door swung open. Inside, there was a single digital recorder. Sarah took it into a private viewing room. Her heart was a drum in her ears. She pressed play. "The estate is a fiction, Eleanor." Robert's voice hissed through the speaker. "I've seen the offshore movements. You didn't just spend the family money, you stole it from the employees' pension fund. If I don't get my cut, I'm going to the authorities." "You've always been a clumsy boy, Robert," Eleanor's voice replied, cold and sharp as a razor. "You think you can threaten me? We built this, and we will ensure it remains built, even if we have to remove the weak bricks." Sarah let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for a decade. It was there. The motive. The confession. She tucked the recorder into her jacket and walked back into the lobby. She was halfway to the door when she saw them. Eleanor was standing by the glass doors, flanked by Thomas Wright and another guard. Eleanor didn't look angry. She looked bored. She clicked her pillbox. Click, clack, click, clack. "Give it to me, Sarah," Eleanor said, her voice echoing in the marble hall. "Don't make this more dramatic than it needs to be." "I have you, Eleanor. Sarah said, holding the recorder tight. "This is over." "Is it?" Eleanor smiled. It was the smile of a shark. Thomas stepped forward. Sarah tried to run, but the second guard caught her from behind, pinning her arms. She struggled, kicking, screaming for the bank's security, but no one moved. The guard who had been facing the wall didn't even turn around. Thomas reached into her pocket and pulled out the recorder. He handed it to Eleanor. "You're a very persistent girl, Sarah," Eleanor said, stepping close. She smelled of sandalwood and antiseptic. "But you've forgotten one thing. In this family, the truth is whatever I say it is." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Did you really think Mark was on your side? Who do you think told me about Robert's key?" Sarah froze. "No. He's been very helpful, darling. He even helped me adjust your dinner last night. That's why you're feeling so light-headed now, isn't it?" The world began to tilt. The marble floor seemed to liquefy beneath Sarah's feet. "Take her to the car," Eleanor commanded. "We have a reservation at the clinic. It's time for Sarah to get the rest she deserves." Subverted beat 3.4. The town car was a tomb of black leather and the smell of expensive conditioner. Sarah was slumped in the back seat, her head lolling against the window. Eleanor sat opposite her, perfectly composed, watching the city lights blur past the tinted glass. "Why?" Sarah managed to croak. Her tongue felt like a thick, dry sponge in her mouth. "Mark, he loved me." Eleanor adjusted her silk scarf, her eyes cold. "Mark loves comfort, Sarah, and he loves safety. He grew up watching what happens to people who disagree with me. He didn't want to be a weak brick like Robert." Sarah's mind raced, trying to find a flaw in the logic, a reason to believe Mark was still her ally. He tried to warn me. At the motel. He told me to run. Eleanor let out a soft, musical laugh. "Oh, Sarah. That wasn't a warning. That was a test. He wanted to see if you still had any evidence left. When you ran to the bank, you gave him exactly what he needed to prove to me that he was loyal." Sarah felt a coldness spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "The brakes, the security system, all Mark," Eleanor said, her voice smooth as cream. "He's an architect, darling. He knows how to dismantle things. He didn't want you dead, not yet. He just wanted you compliant. He was the one who suggested the tonic 3 years ago. He wasn't ready to be a father. It would have interfered with his promotion." The revelation hit Sarah harder than the car crash. She pictured Mark holding her in the hospital after the miscarriage, his tears wetting her shoulder, his voice whispering that they would try again. It had all been theater. Every touch, every "I love you" had been a calculated move in a game she didn't even know she was playing. "He's waiting for us at the facility," Eleanor continued, checking her watch. "He's already signed the commitment papers. He told the doctors he's heartbroken, but he can no longer manage your violent outbursts at home. You're a tragic story, Sarah. The beautiful wife lost to the shadows of her own mind. Mark will be the grieving, devoted husband, and in a year or two, he'll find someone a bit more stable." The car slowed as it turned into a long, gated driveway, lined with weeping willows. Sarah looked at her hands. They were shaking. Not from the drugs, but from the realization that her entire life for the last decade had been a curated lie. She had no one. No husband, no friend, no truth. "We're here," Eleanor said, the car coming to a smooth stop. "Do try to be dignified, Sarah. It makes the intake so much easier for everyone." The door opened. and the smell of industrial lavender flooded the car. Sarah looked up and saw Mark standing under the fluorescent lights of the entrance. He looked sad. He looked perfect. He adjusted his watch and leaned toward her as the guards pulled her from the car. "It's for the best, Sarah," he whispered, his voice full of that familiar, seeking pity. "You understand that, right?" Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't. As they led her toward the heavy steel doors, the only sound was the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of a soap dispenser from somewhere inside. The room was white, not a soft, cloud-like white, but a harsh, clinical glare that seemed to vibrate. There were no windows. The clock on the wall was running backwards, the second hand ticking toward a past she couldn't reach. Sarah lay on the padded floor, her mind a jagged landscape of memories and betrayals. She thought of the sea glass. They had taken it. They had taken everything. A nurse entered, her face a mask of professional detachment. Jennifer Scott. She carried a tray with a small plastic cup and a syringe. "Time for your vitamins, Sarah," she said, her voice a flat monotone. "It's not vitamins," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "Please, I'm not crazy. My mother-in-law, she killed Robert. She's framing me." Jennifer didn't look up. She washed her hands in the sink. Thump, 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 3 times. "We all have our stories, dear. Now, be a good girl and take your medicine." Sarah looked at the room. She was an architect's wife. She'd spent years looking at blueprints over Mark's shoulder. She looked at the ceiling. The ventilation grate was oversized for a room this small. It suggested a shared duct system with the service corridor. She looked back at Jennifer. She needed the nurse to come closer. Sarah began to twitch. She let her head hit the padded wall with a dull thunk. She rolled her eyes back, her body stiffening in a faked seizure. "Nurse!" she gasped. Foam, the result of a bit of hidden soap from the bathroom, bubbling at her lips. Jennifer dropped the tray, the syringe clattering to the floor. She rushed over, leaning down to check Sarah's airway. "Sarah? Sarah, can you hear me?" The moment Jennifer was in range, Sarah's hand shot out. She didn't use the frantic strength of a victim. She used the cold, calculated precision of someone who had nothing left to lose. She caught Jennifer's throat, her thumb pressing into the carotid artery, just as she'd seen in a self-defense video years ago. Jennifer's eyes widened, her hands clawing at Sarah's arm. But Sarah didn't let go. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, "but I have a party to attend." Jennifer slumped into unconsciousness. Sarah moved quickly. She stripped the nurse of her keycard and her white tunic. She dragged the heavy bed frame toward the wall and climbed up, prying the ventilation grate loose with a plastic spoon she'd hidden from dinner. The duct was a narrow, dusty throat of galvanized steel. Sarah crawled, the metal groaning beneath her. She followed the sound of a distant, rhythmic thud, the building's main fan. She moved toward the light, her heart hammering against her ribs. She emerged in a storage closet 3 floors down. She stepped out into the hallway, the nurse's tunic a thin disguise. She walked past the reception desk, her head down, her heart in her throat. The security guard was busy looking at a monitor. She pushed through the front doors and into the cool night air. She didn't run. Running attracted attention. She walked to the edge of the property and slipped through a gap in the fence. She was free, but she wasn't done. The Metropolitan Museum of Art was a shimmering jewel in the darkness of Central Park. Limousines lined the curb like sleek black beetles. The elite of New York were there for the Miller Foundation Gala for Mental Health. The irony was a bitter taste in Sarah's mouth. She approached the service entrance, her nurse's tunic replaced by a black dress she'd stolen from a laundry van. She looked disheveled, her hair a wild mane, her eyes burning with a feverish light. "Delivery for the AV crew," she told the guard, holding up a discarded clipboard. He waved her through. She moved through the labyrinthine corridors of the museum, past ancient Egyptian tombs and silent statues. She reached the control booth overlooking the Great Hall. Inside, a young technician was distracted by his phone. Sarah didn't hesitate. She stepped inside and locked the door. "Hey, you can't be in here," the boy yelled. "Sit down," Sarah said, her voice a cold command, "and give me the patch cord." She pulled the fake diary from her waistband. She had kept it because she knew Eleanor's vanity. Eleanor wouldn't just write nonsense. She would want to keep the real evidence close to mock her. Sarah had found a small, hard lump in the binding hours ago. A micro SD card. She plugged it into the laptop. The screen filled with files. Not just the ledger, but recordings, videos, Eleanor's backups of her own crimes. On the stage below, Eleanor was standing at the podium. She looked magnificent in silver silk. Mark stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, the perfect son. "We are here tonight," Eleanor's voice boomed through the hall, "to talk about the shadows that claim our loved ones. My own daughter-in-law, Sarah, is currently facing such a shadow." "Let's talk about the shadows, Eleanor," Sarah whispered. She hit enter. The giant screens flanking the stage flickered. Eleanor's face disappeared, replaced by a grainy video from a security camera. It was Eleanor and Robert 2 years ago. "The boat is ready, Robert." Eleanor's voice echoed through the great hall, amplified by 10,000 watts of power. "You've made your choice. You wanted the truth. The truth is that you're a liability." The hall went silent. 1,000 heads turned toward the screens. "What are you doing with that wrench, Mom?" Robert's voice was small, terrified. The video showed Eleanor striking him. It showed her standing over him as the boat drifted into the darkness. Eleanor froze on the stage. Her face went from pale to a sickly, mottled gray. She looked up at the control booth, her eyes finding Sarah's through the glass. "Turn it off!" Eleanor screamed, her voice cracking. "It's a forgery, a delusion." Sarah didn't stop. She played the audio of the tonic. She played the records of the bribes. The great hall erupted in chaos. Richard Bennett, the museum chairman, stood up, his face a mask of horror. We find this beyond words," he stammered. Eleanor turned, her eyes wild. She saw the police officers moving through the crowd. She saw the we she had built her life upon crumbling into a me. She lunged toward the stairs, but the crowd blocked her. She was trapped in the temple of her own making. Mark stood on the stage, his hands raised in a gesture of innocence. "I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know." Sarah stepped out of the booth and onto the balcony. She looked down at him. "You knew, Mark. You always knew." The police reached the stage. They took Eleanor's arms. She didn't fight. She just looked at Sarah, her icy smile finally gone, replaced by a vacuum of pure, cold hatred. Seattle was gray, but it was a clean kind of gray. The rain washed the streets, and the mist hid the mountains. Sarah sat on the porch of her small cottage, a cup of coffee in her hands. The air smelled of salt and cedar. It had been 6 months. Eleanor was awaiting trial. Mark was in prison for conspiracy. The Miller legacy was a stain on the front pages of every newspaper in the country. Sarah reached into her pocket. She didn't have the sea glass anymore. She didn't need it. The sharpness was inside her now, a part of her strength. She heard a soft thud on the porch. She looked down. A small white box sat by the door. No return address. She opened it. Inside, nestled in black velvet, was a white queen chess piece. It was vintage, hand-carved, and perfectly balanced. Sarah picked it up. She looked out at the mist. Somewhere, in a prison cell or a hidden office, a new game was being set up. The board was bigger now, the stakes higher. She smiled. It wasn't the smile of a victim. It was the smile of a player who finally knew the rules. She set the queen on the railing and watched the rain wash the dust from its crown. "Your move," she whispered.